Hello there, everybody. I'm joined by two other YouTube people. We have Darth Grader and Mark, and we have Kyle Mullins. And guys, I just want to start by saying that I love both your channels. Both you guys are doing really interesting and unique, different stuff. And I'm just so glad that we kind of gathered today and chat and catch up. So the reason I wanted to gather you guys here is I feel like I've talked about a lot on this channel what brought me into this hobby, which I think my wife is politely described as weird and obscure. But what brought you guys here, and what keeps you around, and where do you see this going? And just kind of talking about Star Wars CCG, talking about collecting. I think those are kind of the points we're hoping to hit today. Is just why do we collect? What do we collect? And where do we see things going? So, Kyle, I think Mark and I have chatted before, but why don't we kind of start with you? Like, what kind of brought you into this hobby? What keeps you around? And why did you start just opening stuff on YouTube?
Yeah, great question. I think I have to start a little bit with just Star Wars in general. Like my first experience watching it was a neighbor had given my mom like one of those VHS like recorded on TV like with the commercials, and also didn't like record the whole movie, kind of thing. So I saw like A New Hope, and then had gotten like piece of God, maybe I was like 7, 7 or 8, and like watching it in my parents' bedroom, like on VHS, all scraggly with occasional commercials and stuff. And I was just like hooked, like jaw dropped with that. And I was like, what can I watch this like for real somewhere? I think we eventually, my mom bought the trilogy set, and like it just stuck with me more so than my brother and sister. But the Star Wars game itself, it was 95. I was gifted the 2-player premiere set with a friend, and at the time, like I didn't know anything about it. I didn't understand. I looked at the rule book; it was massive. I mean, I was a kid, and I was just like, "Wow, these are cool cards," and they all had lore. And keeping in mind, like Star Wars in the 90s, like there was a thirst for it. There was,
Well, it's because Special
all the
Edition was coming
books that
out,
came
right? Like
out.
there's like this relaunch, and there's like more energy. Like
Yeah,
people are thinking about it again. You're hitting like milestones, like 15-year, 20-year anniversary sort of stuff, right? So there was like very like
yeah,
lively
there were
in the
all the
late
like books were coming out. There was some fresh energy into Star Wars, and even though it had kind of been essentially like a desert, as like the older Star Wars fans like refer to, like there was a freshness to it. And I just started buying packs, and I just really liked it. But I didn't even know like there's a complete set of cards for them. I didn't know what was rare or uncommon. I didn't know the difference between whiteboard or blackboard. I just started taking cards and shoving them in a binder because I thought they
It's
looked
funny
cool.
because like hindsight's 2020, but I can't think of like a worse product that was released than Premiere like starter set in like 1995. Like just cannot think of like a less like easy entry point than like these decks that have essentially terrible cards. So it's I think that was my entry point as well. I remember just like obsessing over these cards and I had no idea how to use them. Mark, what about you? I don't think I've really ever heard of how you got into this and what keeps you around now.
Yeah, so back in the day, I mean, with Star Wars, probably a similar story to Kyle. Grew up in the 90s. Parents are into it. Kids, for whatever reason, are into it even before special edition. So, I grew up watching the original trilogy before all the Lucas revamps. But for the card game of Star Wars CCG, I got into it through a friend when I was, what was it be, 1996, 97, right before Dagobah came out. So I got into it then. Just went to the local, I think it was just like a bookstore that happened to have Star Wars cards. Just started buying those because, I mean, yeah, that was my first real collectible card game. Because I think there was also like Magic. I had a couple of those, but mostly Star Wars until Pokemon came out. That kind of took my energy
Were
away.
you were you a Pokemon guy? You can confess. Like we're not going to tell anybody. But were
Right?
you a Pokemon guy?
Maybe a little bit. I actually started collecting after like I actually was lucky because I live here in Seattle. That's next to Wizards of the Coast, so maybe that had to do with there being a decent amount of like first edition base set here. So I actually had a pretty decent amount of that. But after I think maybe like Fossil or Jungle, I started collecting Japanese Pokemon. But funny enough, I don't really collect much Japanese Star Wars. But yeah, I did go to Pokemon for a little bit, just because mostly actually the shiny cards. I thought that was really cool.
Yeah.
So, and although I know, Star Wars had reflections, but they were like the same cards as before. So at the time, it didn't really like, well, why would I want like the same card but just shiny? But now it's actually funny because it's one of my favorite sets, and I really do like those foil cards.
So the reason I ask this stuff, guys, is because I think there's so many similar narratives like this. Like everybody kind of has this story, and I really think it's important to normalize. Like it's okay to collect dead card games. It's okay to collect things. Like I think it's just so interesting to hear these stories and like how we all got into it. And now we're all guys in our 30s and 40s, and it's just like it's okay and normal to kind of collect this stuff. So kind of moving the collecting piece. So fast forward, it's 2022. What are you collecting now? What keeps you kind of collecting? And what's sort of like the next thing, or what's the interesting thing in your opinion? Kyle, do you want to start off?
Yeah, I mean, so I was trying to explain to my wife before. I feel like there's two different kinds of people. My brother's kind of opposite. Like once a collector, always a collector. And I've heard this in different hobbies, but there's something to be said about having something tangible in your hands that you can, speak to and trade and, assess a value to. And then there's people that are more comfortable with like stocks and crypto and all that. And I have that, but those things are tanking. These are not, like this is what I understand. This is where my assets lie. And, from collecting standpoint, I would say my first collection of anything was like Bazooka Joe comics from those 5-cent gum things. Like they were cheap, but I was like, oh, there's 50 of them. I can collect all 50, like they're not worth anything, but I thought that was.
So can I tell you, one of my most prized possessions was I sent in 1,000 Bazooka wrappers, and I have a Bazooka Joe t-shirt from like 1992. Like if you sent in enough wrappers, they put in a t-shirt, and it didn't fit until recently because they sent me like a 7-year-old kid, size extra large, right? But like now I'm like, oh yeah, I rock this all the time. So like I get that, I get it.
Well, yeah. So I guess that's I've always kind of been into collecting things, but I collect things to a point, right? Because I don't want to just openly collect everything. That's just hoarding. When Star Wars cards came along, I was definitely collecting those. It was buying just packs in the mall. Anytime I could get $20 here or there, like I was like, I'm off to the mall to buy some cards. I don't know what I was getting, but it was fun. But later I'd say, well, let's see. I collect HO model trains as well.
I'm sorry. What are those HO model?
HO model trains. And I'll come back to why I'm saying this. And $2 bills, like historical ones, like 1862 to like 1928. And that collection is worth far more than my Star Wars cards, but I've been collecting Star Wars cards the longest. And I would say that's been a circular thing in that I'll go on like a kick of picking up some HO trains, then I'll kind of die out of that and then go to buying some Star Wars cards. And then, I'd fizzle out of that and then be in a big currency kick and look for really rare twos, which are really expensive. And then, flip into something else, and then it just kind of comes back. And my Star Wars collecting, even though started in the 90s, kind of faded or came not as front of mind after maybe Reflections 2, I think, was coming out. So maybe it was like, because I had like one pack of that, but I didn't have any of the episode 1 stuff. So I must have stopped around 2000 or so in high school. And then I wasn't buying again until like much later, maybe like 2016, 17, 18. I was actually in Seattle. I think in 2018 was when I finished my like English master set and bought a bunch of sealed product, which at the time was more expensive than, I had ever seen it. But relative to now, it's like 15, 20% of the price. So I'm glad I did that. I mean, I would have stocked up on more if I'd known, but in the back of my mind, it was like, yeah, but
yeah, I was going to say, it's interesting to think about 2018 prices describing, it's like 15 to 20% of what they were now, but it's really hard for me to think of like any sort of retracing to that level ever happening, right? Like, I just think it's not super feasible that we'll ever see that level, despite like, unless there's truly like an apocalyptic recession or something,
I think it's important to note that, whether this price had stayed the same, or even dipped a little or gone up, like it was still my goal to finish my sets and like
Right.
pick up sealed product. So, because to me, like Andy, speaks to me as a collector in that he likes to own it. Like I wanted to own it. The Japanese stuff wasn't even on my radar. I remember when Hoth complete sets were $500. I was going to bid on one. I like forgot watching it one day, and tournament foils were $200. I was like, oh, there's like a bunch. I'll wait until I buy it. Like looking back,
mistakes were made
now, but at the time I was like $200. I was like, it's not even mint. I'm like,
I mean, it kind of goes a little bit to something. And Mark, I'd love to hear your thoughts here, but like part of the reason why I want some things is because they're expensive, right? Like truly, like if Japanese Hoth sets, which are sort of like the holy grail for many folks, were $200, then it's like, well, I'll wait. It's still cheap, right? But like suddenly when it's $10,000, it's like, wait, hold on. Like I need to have this before it becomes 15,000. It's like the same thing with the crypto, right? It's like Bitcoin's $100 and no one wants it. And it's like, 70,000, everyone's going crazy or whatever it was, 68,000. So Mark, I'm curious, what about you? Like kind of where are you at collecting wise right now? So you're very into grading. I'd love to kind of hear your stance on this stuff.
Right. Yeah, I might have a different take than quite a few people in the Star Wars community. Like I know there's a lot of players probably have a very different view than myself, but I'm also probably different than most collectors in that, like for me, sets have really never done it. I mean, when I was a kid, I would be one of those kids who'd be like pulling open the packs, like, oh, red card, rare, whatever, garbage, like location. I don't care about that. Like I just want the main characters, or maybe like some of the cool side characters, like Salacious,
like some random alien that like the text says that they like, or I don't know. Like some of the lore text is very funny to actually.
Like soft Pelican.
Yeah, I did actually like the lore text. I did like the story part because I actually did know, when I was a kid, like all those factoids on there. I did think that was the coolest thing. But still, when I'm opening a pack, like I'm not trying to get like force push or anything. Like no one cares about that. Like you got to get the main characters. So even now, I kind of still have a little bit of that in me. But a large part of I think what I get a joy out of is with grading, it kind of appeals to a different group of collectors. And I think as far as cards go as a hobby, grading in the last couple of decades has really kind of taken over as the way to kind of buy, sell, and trade cards. The ones that are great. There's just a lot larger of an audience now in general in terms of like sports collectors, that sort of thing. So when you're in that market, you kind of appeal to a different demographic than say with raw cards. And what I kind of like is when people will kind of reach out and be like, oh yeah, like Star Wars cards, I remember these back from when I was growing up in the 90s. And I get that so often, and it just feels great every time you kind of get someone remembering, oh, like yeah, these were a thing. And it's kind of feels like it maybe matured as a hobby when they start seeing graded versions of the cards come out. And I think that's really kind of what keeps me going doing this, is just seeing people kind of reclaim a piece of their youth, or just seeing, even if they weren't into it back in the day, you can still appreciate the great craftsmanship that went into designing the cards, just the way they look really nice, the lore, working with Lucasfilm, things like that. Like it's just a great card game overall for collectors.
Yeah, and I think it's a unique one where, I'm a part of a couple other communities of dead card games or out of print card games where there's just the collecting. That's all there is. Mm-hmm. There's only collecting. Virtually no one plays it. But this game, it's not a huge playing community, but it's a couple hundred, maybe a couple thousand if you count GEMP games. So there is like a solid number of people that still play this, and I think to me, it's really impressive after like 20 years to still have like a viable meta from like essentially like technology or like something that's like kind of like 25 years old, like the mechanics and stuff. So I think to me, that's what's so interesting. And Kyle, you live 40 minutes away from it. We are going to get together and play this sometime. I swear. I just... I don't want to play with Andy because Andy's actually very good, and I think that he'll we'll have an unfun time if we actually play. But I think we could have a fun time just sort of recreating some iconic moments, and that's what's so unique about this game. From if you ever play it, it's like the ability to like actually you have Lando battling Boba Fett, right? That's kind of fun, right? That's very thematic and just unique from that standpoint. Shifting gears a little bit, guys, but like what is on your collecting radar right now? So I've done a couple of videos on Lorcana. I just talked about Conan. I'm getting a little bit into the Japanese cards in Star Wars CCG, and I kind of love to hear what you guys are up to collecting wise, or where your sights are kind of set. With out of print stuff, there's no new sets coming out, right? So you kind of have to. It's a bit of a write your own adventure novel. Like, where do you go from here? And I kind of struggled for like a couple months. For like, all right, what do I want to do now? Right? Like, I have all the sets. Like, what now? So curious to hear what you guys are up to.
Take it, Kyle.
Yeah, so I'm missing a few sealed boxes, but I wouldn't say I'm like urgently needing to get them. Like, if I find a good deal, like, I guess I'll grab them. But at the end of the day, I'm like, well, what am I going to do with these? Even with the ones I have, like, am I eventually going to open these, or am I going to sell them as some sort of fixed good because I invested in this box, And we can all see that the prices of a lot of boxes that are out there on eBay, like, people are thinking to themselves, like, even if I got all the wins, like, I'm not going to make money back on that box, as it stands right now. There's people that are going to be like, oh no, it's to the moon, like, and that's cool. But I like the cards themselves. I want to open some more stuff on my channel. But for me, Star Wars customizable card game, the only one I really don't have is the Hoth Japanese stuff. I don't think I have interest in hunting down singles for that. It's expensive, they're rare, and there's frankly enough people that I think are going for it that if I really wanted it one day, I'm sure I could buy a complete set off of it. But it seems almost too daunting. The Premier Japanese, I'm about 29 cards away from that. That's been a fun pet project because even if I get something I have, it's going towards your future collection of Japanese Premier. And then the extras on top of that, I could sell or put out. And, either way, it makes good content. In terms of like the graded stuff, I've done a bunch of stuff with HGA, but my goal now is actually looking at cards. So like, for example, I have a bunch of cards up here. And what I'm looking for is, do they have interesting backgrounds that could potentially make for a really good custom foil? Like you kind of saw this one earlier, but and then I look at other ones that are like, well, I'm not sure what they would do with that. Maybe they could do.
Do you have any of your HGA returns handy? I don't know if you have them next to you. I think those are pretty cool the way they look. The HGA returns.
The HGA returns it's been an interesting journey because they're certainly not really recognized in the Star Wars community. I'm not immune to that. I'm not pretending like this is the greatest thing ever because I recognize I'm an outsider in that, but I like the art of, well, yeah, I like the art of them. And I've been I've listed some other ones I haven't listed, but people ask me like, hey, I really want that slab. I like that. It's like, if you have your friends over and you want to show them something, what slab are you going to show them? Like the one with plain text or the one that looks like artistic. And in my mind, it's almost like a conversation piece. Like even if it's not super expensive or it's never going to be worth $1,000, I don't know. I don't really care. Like it's just kind of cool to look at. Like I like seeing it. I like watching them on display. But people are warming up to it a little bit. I've submitted a bunch of cards that I don't think will either look good with a custom background or not, doesn't make sense to like Beckett or PSA. So I'm waiting on some other returns. So it's been kind of more of an experiment, but people really like, the things like those Hoth custom slabs. Like a lot of people asked me for that. They're like, this is really cool. I already traded it to Holda, but I had another one too that got sniped up pretty quick too. Even if they don't grade really well, they look cool. So,
I mean, ultimately, like aesthetics is everything, right? Like you want your stuff to look cool. I do think PSA, it's interesting. They've just been using this like standard template for a very long time, seemingly, right? They've done some like minor, improvements along like the security mechanisms on it, but they've made no attempt to like have any sort of creative drive or change. And so I am wondering, like, if you're truly doing this partially for aesthetics, like, why there's not a little more customization. So I think HGA is doing interesting stuff there. What about you, Mark? I'm kind of curious. What are you looking at next or thinking about next?
So within the realm of Star Wars CCG, I kind of just stick to my small universe of, especially I like the foil cards. I I don't know why, because I didn't really like them when I was collecting originally. But again, I think I mentioned before on one of the interviews, like when I got back into collecting Star Wars CCG, I was like, oh my gosh, they have like foil versions of all the cards that I used to love to collect back in the day, and I never knew about it. So it's like a whole different adventure. But yeah, I mean, it's just one of those things. I think when people get back into it, they just think it's cool to have these shiny versions of the cards. So that's for Star Wars CCG. As far as outside of Star Wars CCG, honestly, I don't really. I mean, my other main card game that I play is probably Magic, Magic the Gathering. So I usually play Arena, so that's online, and that doesn't really have. I mean, you could try to be a whale in the game and try to like buy a whole bunch of cards. But I mean, gosh, how much would that cost? I don't even want to think
print
about
run
it.
is just too massive for Magic, right? It's
Yeah.
Yeah. I've fallen out of love. I think the last 6 months I got into it, and then I've fallen out of love again, because I think that Wizards is doing something like pretty exploitive with it right now. Like between like the secret layers and like collector's boosters, it feels like they've hit this point where there's just too much product. They're trying to extract too many dollars, and you're starting to hit that like negative reaction from fans.
Right.
And this is frankly like one of my big arguments for out of print games is there's just been so much cool stuff that has been done in the past, whether it's like cool art, cool mechanics, foiling. I mean, this like Conan game that I've gotten into, it's just the art's like rad, man. It's just like kind of fun to look at this stuff and to think like, this is cheaper than a pack of this is hard to find, but it's still cheaper than a pack of a collector's booster. Like a collector's booster for Magic is like $47 or something, right? Like this stuff is cheap in comparison to like modern card games.
I guess that's the nice thing, and maybe potentially the dangerous thing about Star Wars CCG, and probably also some of the others you're into, like Lord of the Rings, is I can really easily talk myself into being like, well, this is a good place to park money, right? Because that's one of the things, you have $1 or $10, like let's say, to spend. Like, okay, you could put it into Star Wars CCG. What are alternatives? We got all these like modern card games that people are kind of trying to speculate on, like to be like the next MTG or something like that. Like, oh, I put money in here and it'll be worth
Flesh and Blood.
Exactly. And like maybe it works out for them, but for me, like I just know, it's a great IP. Star Wars is. A lot of people like this game back in the day. It's not going to get reprinted, so it's just hard for me when I'm thinking about like, okay, I only have so many like hobby things I could put money into. Why not just keep putting it into Star Wars?
Well, it is something to be said, like, for instance, like I walk into Target and you go to the card section, like in the very, very back of my mind, I'm like, ooh, maybe there'll be some like Star Wars card I really like, but there's not. Like it's Magic, Pokemon, Yu-Gi-Oh, and baseball, and it's been like sorted through, and like kind of like sinks back to reality a little bit, like, but there was something exciting about going out and finding something in the wild, that's really, really not possible anymore. Maybe it's not, but it's super rare to find that stuff in the wild anymore.
I do think that like those really
corners.
random, weird, wild finds have passed. Maybe in like 10 years, there'll be an entire generation of like estate sales happening, RIP to these future people. But like, I think right now, COVID is like dried up. Like the storage units have been cleared out. The comic book stores that closed in the 2005. Because I found a lot of my sealed product from like weird stuff where it's like guys that own comic book stores that put it in a storage unit and forgot about it. And then they like suddenly in 2020, they're bored and, they're sorting out their storage unit. Like that happened to me 3 separate times with different people that had like massive collections and storage units where like I got some very weird and insane product from.
Yeah, I gotta see some of that product, by the way.
Yeah, I mean, I got a Lord of the Rings Hunter box, which is just like unfindable from like a guy that just owned a store, like found it. I made him a pretty generous offer, and he's like, "Sure, that's way more money than I ever thought this was worth." Like that's just like an unfindable product. But I think that those sort of instances have like dried up at this point. Like I just don't think that like there's as many. Like COVID chased everyone and like everyone cleaned out their garage, right? And there's no more like garages or attics or storage units or whatever to clean out at this point. But that's my own theory. Maybe it's still out there. Guys, this has been a lot of fun. I think let's wrap up here. Any kind of closing thoughts? I mean, we're going to definitely do this again, but trying to keep things kind of tight. I love having you guys on here. Any final thoughts for the folks in the audience, whoever's still here?
Thanks for tuning in as always. It's always a pleasure to be on your channel, Matt. And yeah, thanks for being on too, Kyle. It was awesome interacting with you as well. I hope we do more shows together.
I'm going to leave you guys like and subscribe, obviously, to both their channels. I'll leave links to their channels in the show notes so folks can go over there and check them out. Both these guys are doing really awesome stuff.
Yeah, no, this is awesome. I don't know why we don't do this more often, but I would say for my final thoughts would be for anybody who's looking to get back into the game to just follow Matt's channel, because like a lot of people message me about, you know, product price or getting back into the game and all that. Like I just kind of point them to your channel because you've already got all this reference material. I'm just going to be opening up content and getting people excited, and Mark's going to solemnly open stuff and tell us about his grading.
I really just need them to like
different.
plug into Andy Talaga's brain. We're just like, all right, Andy is like here to talk about like why in 1998 Monarch was a superior card to like whatever, like just like really obscure, weird, just like, yeah, exactly. I'm like, oh, that's cool, Andy. Like we're supposed to do some videos tomorrow, and he's like, all right, I don't know if I can keep this to under 40 minutes. I'm like, well, let's try really hard. Let's try really hard to not put like a 45-minute video on like deck making. So anyways, guys, this is a lot of fun. And we'll see you next time.